when we live in accordance with the standards that we set, then, and we clearly start to communicate this, then what happens is boundaries become super easy to uphold. And then it doesn't have to be this, kind of anger behind or forcefulness that you, anytime anybody does something, you push back on them. Welcome to The Way of the Muse, a podcast for women who want to create richness in every area of their lives, from business and career to lifestyle, relationships, family, purpose, and fulfillment. I'm Gigi Sage.
And I'm Makena Sage. We're a mother-daughter coaching team, and combined, we've spent over 4 decades helping people create their best and most fully expressed lives. If you're ready to step into your bigger dreams with ease, fun, and flow, you're in the right place. Let's get into the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Way of the Muse. I'm Makena.
And this is Gigi.
Yeah, we're excited to be back with you all this week, talking about a topic that I feel like is a very hot topic. I've been wanting to do this episode for a while, which is boundaries. How do you set boundaries in your personal life, in your work, or your professional life, and do that in such a way that it's effective and not, maybe we would say, like abrasive, or, don't kind of alienate people or disrupt your relationships. So that's what we're going to start with today. And Gigi, do you want to say anything before we jump in?
Yeah, like you said, this is a topic that comes up a lot in coaching, right? Because when we work with people, of course, we're working with their relationships and all the different things in their, those arguments and things that are going on. And often I'll, have a client that will come to me and say, I'm setting boundaries. And like you said, Makena, you can feel immediately this is not going to be pretty, right? They thought they were having issues before, but now when they set this boundary, because of from where it's coming from. So I think it's super exciting. We're talking about this today to let people know there's an approach and a way to approach this where it doesn't have to be an all or nothing kind of attitude.
Definitely. Yeah. Because what we see here a lot is what we're calling the pendulum swing. And of course, there's pendulum swings and all kinds of things. But if you imagine a pendulum going all the way from one side to the other side, this is often what happens with people around boundaries. So usually people who don't have a lot of boundaries in place, what ends up happening is eventually they get resentful or they get frustrated, and that just builds up and builds up. And then they might swing to the other side where it's like every little transgression or perceived transgression of their boundaries feels huge. And then they overreact. And so it's like they go from kind of not really setting boundaries often or letting people kind of walk all over them to the other side where then they're overly reacting.
Oh,
so this creates...
Go ahead. I'm so embarrassed because I see myself in this.
Oh, she was like, you wrote this episode about me? I'm like, no, I literally did not even think about you. But I guess it was a good self-reflection moment. Oh, well, we all have our areas, right? So what ends up happening here is this creates a lot of drama. Sometimes it can even damage relationships. And some people start cutting people out of their lives. They're like, well, they can't hold my boundaries, so they've got to go, kind of thing. And, there may be occasionally time or place for that. But for the most part, there's, again, like you said, Gigi, there's a way to approach this that you don't have to get to that point. And that's what we really want for our listeners. So
yeah. And there's actually kind of a problem with the word boundary because it has this energy attached to it. It implies that like there's a wall between you and someone else. And so what we want to share, first of all, is that a better approach to this is boundaries are first and foremost about the standards you actually set for yourself. And I think that for myself has been, Makena, you've taught me so much about this, is to really see what's right for me and everything, right? Because sometimes I just don't even look at that.
Mm.
And also it's about really being clear, like I said, what's right for me, what's wrong for me, what works, what doesn't work in my world, you know. And when we live in accordance with the standards that we set, then, and we clearly start to communicate this, then what happens is boundaries become super easy to uphold. And then it doesn't have to be this, you know, kind of anger behind or forcefulness that you, anytime anybody does something, you know, you push back on them, you know, if they
Yeah.
cross. It just starts to, you know, the main thing I think about boundaries and you know, setting up what works in relationship and communication is always, for me, it's like, how does it start to create more harmony? And it definitely creates more harmony because you're not nitpicking about a lot of little things then.
Yeah, I think this is a huge misconception, is that boundaries need to be drama, or that it's going to always create a lot of conflict or drama. But the real reason for boundaries, like you're saying, is to actually eliminate a lot of that. It's like, if these things are clear and they're in place, and I often use the example of being in my previous career in marketing and copywriting, where every time an issue would come up with a client and it felt like something wasn't clear, and then, you know, they crossed a boundary, it felt like, for me, or they thought I did something, I would look at whatever that was and I would go, I'm writing this into my contract for next time. And I would work with my lawyer and I would write in all of the timelines, the expectations, everything into my contract, and really go over that with the client before I, you know, signed on with someone new. So over the years, I mean, the contract was robust. It wasn't too crazy, but it was just like, hey, here's the expectation. I'm going to deliver you drafts by these dates. You know, I expect a review by this date. If that doesn't happen, here's what happens. You know, I may need to prioritize other work. And so what that did is, it just, over time, it made things clearer and clearer. And there was less and less breakdowns with my clients, and miscommunications and frustration on both sides. So we're not always going to do that in depth of a contract, although we will talk about, you can use contracts in your personal life as well as your professional life. Oh, Chloe. Gigi's here in California with me, so she's got my doggy on her lap. So cute. Yeah, but you can use contracts in your personal and professional life, and that can really clarify things. But even if it's an unspoken contract or it's just a verbal agreement, similarly, again, the result should be that for both parties over time, there's less frustration and less confusion. And like you said, Gigi, more harmony.
Yeah. Yeah. The
Yeah.
bottom line is harmony, and to take the push and pull out of things. And I have, you know, all my clients that they're listening know, I have them write contracts with their kids. I have them write contracts with everyone, because in it, there's accountability on both sides. You know, what it does is it really sets up, like, I know what's expected of me, and then the person knows what is expected of them. And even with our children, because that's where things can really get murky, right?
Yeah.
And it just starts to also teach your children, like, oh, okay, here's something I said I would do this, and if I don't keep my word, there are consequences. There's things that are happening. And I think it's just a great way to start to learn and be accountable. And again, this is, you know, I can't even tell you how many times in all my decades of coaching where people are going into something and I say to them, do you have a contract? Or do you have something written? Yeah, we'll get it, we'll get it. And then down the road, they didn't do it. And then it backfires again and again and again. Because here's the thing, we never really remember exactly what we said, right?
Mm.
And I always say this too, when money starts moving in a situation, if it's a business deal, then people forget. Yeah. And they remember certain parts of it, they don't remember other parts of it. And not to say they're bad people or anything, that's human nature. And that's why we have contracts, right? Is we put it in, what it does, you put it in writing, it's there, and it gives us the opportunity then to freeze us up to then have great relationships, or have a great dynamic in a working relationship where we don't have to worry about all those kinds of things.
What do you think it is that people don't want to put contracts in place? I mean, I get personally that's maybe a stretch for some people, and we could talk about that. It doesn't have to be a legally binding contract.
No. Yeah.
But even in professional situations, I see this all the time. I've seen it all through my years of coaching as well, is people like skirt around this. They don't want to put the contract down, they're like, does it make them uncomfortable? Like, what do you think that is?
Maybe I don't know what it is. That's a really good question, McKenna. Maybe it's incurring the cost in the beginning to get a lawyer and actually do a contract, But a lot of times you don't have to do like a full out legal contract. It's just a matter of writing down the agreement and what the two people agreed upon. It's in writing, it's signed, and then, any kind of thinking through also what could come up, in a new agreement or whatever. And really, again, past experiences give you information. So seeing what worked or what didn't work in a previous situation when you were in, and then you, like you did, you start to correct to where you get pretty good seeing what's going to work, when you put it down on paper, or what works in such a way that it serves both people. The other thing is that we assume, here's one of the biggest things, we assume when we say something and we agree upon something that the other person sees things the way we do. This is one of, again, a human nature thing. I can say, I was talking about this with a client the other day. I can say, integrity is really important to me. And she can say, well, it is to me too. But if we sat down and when we mapped out what we think integrity, we could have two completely different definitions, right?
Yeah.
You
I always think about, imagine there's a 6 written on the sidewalk in between you and somebody else. They're standing on the other side of the 6 and you're standing on this side, and you're both standing there, and one of you's like, it's a 6, and the other one's like, it's a 9.
Right.
It's a 6, it's a 9, and you're both like, you're both right.
Yeah.
Right. But you might not have figured out that the other person thought it was a 9 until down the road. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just kind of a funny example. But what you're saying of like, yeah, we have no idea what people hear, how they interpret things differently than we do. And we just make the assumption. And I think people want to think the best. And maybe that's it too, is like, people go, oh, somehow if I put a contract in place, then I'm like doubting the integrity of this person, or I'm making them feel some way or something like that. And that's not it at all, right? It's actually truly, I think about contracts and agreements as setting you both up for success in the short term and the long term, right?
Absolutely.
Setting you up to protect your relationship a lot of the time, because then there's not those breakdowns down the road.
That's such a great point, because in the long run, from my experience, most of the time it does protect your relationship. And it shouldn't be like, oh, we're setting a contract because we don't trust. It's like we're setting a contract because we want to be able to have all the questions answered and on paper. So in the back of our minds, we're not sitting at home going, oh, well, I hope she's going to do this, or I hope they mean this. And that's what ends up happening. People spend so much time in their minds and thinking and fighting, and then it ends up in a business. And I mean, this is kind of a different direction, but you and I have experienced that, right? With many people, and people are successful in business, and because things weren't written out, they ruined their businesses and lost millions of dollars.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I think I'm so boundaried, even though you say it's a growth area for you, but I think is really because you've taught me so much around this in my life, and you've always talked me through this. And so in that, I've never been afraid to, not never been afraid, but like I've always gone into this, right? So when I would have I had a big contract with a client at one point, I remember, and I spent weeks negotiating with them up front on the contract. And I was so glad in the end that I did. And I think the fear there too, sometimes for people, is like, well, if I do that, maybe they won't want to work with me anymore. Or maybe I'll lose the contract. But, it was really important, because then I came back to the letter of that contract later. And if I hadn't done that up front, it would have been a very messy situation, down the road. So I was really And we're talking a lot about contracts, like employment contracts, or if you're going into business with someone or whatever that might be. But again, you can use the essence of this even in your personal life to, just like Gigi's saying, write something out on a piece of paper that clearly outlines your agreements with someone and sign it. And it's the spirit of that, and you both having a copy of that,
Mm-hmm.
that matters, not the legally binding nature of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Because then sometimes people want to go back and change their minds, and that's great, but it's not really great if we made this agreement. Now, if you write on the contract there, we will negotiate this again on such and such time, that's a different thing, right? So this is for this agreement, we're going to do this, but we are going to revisit this and see if we want to change this agreement at a certain time. So a lot has to be thought through there, but it's so well worth thinking through these things just to save yourself time, pain, money, emotional stress, drama, like you said, and relationships in the long run.
Yeah, and I think that is probably another reason people don't want to do this, is they're just moving quickly, and they don't want to stop and sort of think about this all up front. But the truth is, like you're saying, it saves you so much time and energy and everything in the long run. So that's really important to think about. So I want to come back to this idea of people who, you said one of the points you said a little while ago is that boundaries are first and foremost standards that we set for ourselves. And so I wanted to give some examples of what do we mean by that? Because like that's, I don't know, it's a concept most people haven't really thought about. So one example could be, maybe you're someone that you never check emails, work emails on your weekends, right? So over time, even if your entire company culture is that everybody's checking their work emails on the weekends, if you're not doing that, then people come to know that that's just a boundary for you, or a standard that you're upholding for yourself. And so there's not this sort of expectation anymore. Or maybe you even put something in place where you have an autoresponder that goes out and says, hey, I'll get back to you first thing Monday morning. So that's something that is a standard maybe you have for yourself, but then other people start to go, oh, okay, and they kind of get it over time, if that makes sense. Another version would be someone who doesn't gossip, someone who doesn't talk negatively about other people. And so over time, it's like people might start to try to have those kinds of conversations with you, and you don't make a big deal out of it. You just don't engage, right? And then over time, I think what would happen there for a lot of people is they just realize, like, oh, this isn't the kind of conversation to be having around this person, right? They're not going to engage in this kind of topic. So again, it doesn't have to be a big deal, like, oh, I don't do that. I mean, you could say something if you wanted to, but it's just like people, through watching your behavior, start to understand, like, oh, this is how she operates, right? And then a third example would be, if you're someone who really, you only commit to something if you have the bandwidth and you are actually going to follow through on it. Because how many people, how many of us say yes when we really mean no, or say yes when we're really too busy or too overextended? I used to do this all the time. But if you really start to take a step back, and, we encourage our clients to take 24 hours or to come talk to us first before they commit to new things sometimes, and you start to build that muscle, then people start to see you as someone who keeps their word, someone who they know, if you say you're going to do it, you're going to do it, or you say no. Yeah. So those are a few examples.
Yeah. I love those examples. Yeah. Yeah. So you probably want to know then, how can I identify where I need to or want to set better boundaries, right? A lot of people are like, I don't really know, they don't really understand it. And some ways and places you can do that is, like Makena said, are there places where you're actually saying yes and you really mean no? Or also it's to start to look at, and this is for me, where do I start to feel kind of resentful or frustrated on a regular basis? Like, I have certain areas where I've defined that, and I've started to see, how do I clean that up? And what am I tolerating that I don't actually want to tolerate, anymore? I was working with my coach, and he was like, where is it that you need to say, that's enough. That's enough. I don't want to do that anymore. And where do I feel like I'm giving more than I'm receiving? So there's some great places to begin to see, where do you feel, or where is it showing up that maybe you need some boundaries?
Yeah, those are great
Mm,
questions. So,
mm,
like you said, where are you saying yes? Where you want to say no, or giving more than receiving? And, we're not going to go deep into like, what's the why behind why you're doing that? Because yes, it may matter to some degree, or you may want to explore that. But here we're just really talking about how can you shift it, right? Where is it coming up? And then how can you make a shift there? So, not so much analyzing why am I a people pleaser, or why do I, do this, but really looking to see like, where is this showing up in my life? And then from there, that gives you a little bit of a map to, okay, maybe you pick one or two things and you start there to practice. Yeah.
yeah.
So some common scenarios, like where these kinds of things might show up, right? Where right now we're in this question of like, where do I need to set these boundaries? So giving examples here in different areas of your life, maybe at work, you've been saying yes to projects when you really mean no, or just when you're too busy, you're just like, okay, yeah, I'll take that on. I'll do that, whatever. You just keep saying yes. And then you end up frustrated, or you end up super stressed, or you end up burning out, which doesn't really ultimately serve the business, right? The company. And so in that, if you can really start to backtrack and go, okay, how do I start to, again, look at what my bandwidth really is? And then if I can't do it, say I can't do that right now, or can I do this later? Or a big one here is like, if you work in a job or something like this, it's really just sharing the reality of like, hey, here's everything on my plate. I would love to say yes to this, but I can't do all of this in this time frame. I'm just not going to be able to get all that done. What do you see as a priority? Let's say you were talking to your boss or something like that. And that's a great way to, you're not saying no, but you're just saying, here's the reality. And, how could what do you see I need to approach and work on first? So that's a good example.
Mm,
With clients, a big one we see. So if you're someone who works with clients in your business, like we work with coaching clients, then a lot of times we see the people get frustrated. Like coaches we've trained, for example, with their clients, they might get frustrated because people keep canceling on them last minute, or they're always contacting them outside of business hours, or, scope creep is what it's called, when it's like, this was the original scope of our project. And then they kind of keep asking for more and more and
mm,
more. And you're just like, okay, okay, okay. And at some point, that doesn't feel good anymore, right? So those are kind of some examples to maybe spark some ideas of where, you might get to set some better boundaries with your clients. What about personally, Gigi, like with friends? What would be some examples?
yeah. Always running late. If you have friends that run late all the time, or they cancel at the last minute. And, for you, time is super important to me. And it really doesn't work for me if I have somebody in my life that does that. And, that too is something that there maybe at some point just have a conscious conversation and really say, I value your time and I value my time, and I would love it if you can't make it, that at least I get a text or something. You don't just kind of ghost me, or that in the future that you let me know ahead of time if you can't make it. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
and make it on
absolutely.
time. Mm,
Or you could have a conversation. I mean, there are friends that's just their MO, and you could just have a
mm.
conversation with them and be like, hey, I'm going to expect that you're always going to be running 30 minutes late. So I'm going to show up 30 minutes late. I mean, seriously, you could do something like that with someone and just be like, so
Yeah.
if I'm the one that's late, then that's why, you know? So there's humorous ways to do this as well.
Yeah.
You have to see what really works for you.
Mhm.
What are some other examples of like boundary scenarios that people might be crossing their own boundaries or not setting boundaries?
Yeah. So with team members, not following through on commitments, I see this a lot. And, again, that what happens there is there's frustration and frustration in a team because maybe one person's not following through. And so it's super important again to see and acknowledge like what are those commitments that are being made and asking people, can you do this? And if you don't, then what do we do about that? Because, if you're in a team and everybody's pulling their weight and one person keeps on not coming through with their commitment, then that again needs to be brought up and really see what would work here. Maybe they need some kind of support, but to address it and not just have the frustration. I think that's
Yeah.
so important. Yeah.
Yeah. And in a relationship, it might be something like your partner is not helping out with household responsibilities, and you've just kind of been doing all of the things, and you haven't had a conscious conversation to talk through, like, what would you like their support with, or what is the expectation for both of you there, or just, your partner not following through on something they said they would do. So those kinds of frustrations build up a lot in relationships. So again, we're just giving you examples here to start to spark in your mind, like, what are those areas where I am feeling frustrated, or where I am having sort of, it's funny because it's not even really a boundary violation necessarily, or a crossing of a boundary, if you haven't really set the boundary yet, or you haven't really identified it or communicated it. And so we'll talk about how to do that next. But first, you have to really see what are those areas for you. So that's a little kind of homework exercise. You can pause the podcast and write all those down, or just be thinking about them in your mind, and what are maybe the top one or two that you want to really work on. So then the question becomes, Gigi, how can I communicate my boundaries to others in a healthy way? So not an abrasive way, or that sort of like putting that wall up between the two of you, which is not what we're looking for, but really, in a way that gets the result that we both want.
Yeah, I think to get clear about what you want, and you have to ask yourself some questions. If you're really being completely honest about what your needs are, what would you ask for? What is it that you want? Where's the frustration coming from? What are you frustrated about? And, what would I ask for or do differently if I really trusted that people would still respect and love me? Like you said, maybe it's that you're worried that if I ask for what I want, it might send people away, or they might not do it, or what do I do if they don't do it? It might cause more conflict. And what am I afraid will happen if I set this boundary? I think that's really important to look into your fear. Like we talked about earlier, maybe sometimes when you talked about you had put it into a contract and had really, really been specific ahead of time. And like you said, I'm sure part of you worried that maybe you wouldn't have gotten that job,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
yeah, is that true?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there was always a chance they would go, she's being too,
Yeah.
upfront, too difficult with this, or something like that. And I wasn't trying to be difficult. I was just like, I need to really understand all the parts of this contract and make sure that we're clear on certain things that we agreed to. I wasn't asking over the top. It was like we verbally said some things, and then when I would read the contract, it wouldn't be 100% maybe in line, or I didn't feel like it covered it. But sure, there was a part of me in the back of my mind that was like, okay, well, if they back off and say this is too much, then I have to be okay with that. And that can be a scary thing to do. But to me, that was worth it, because there was enough, again, money and just time and everything involved in that. And I just had a feeling it was really important. So
Yeah. So you have to be willing to take that risk, because again, time and time I've seen when people don't do this, that it ends up down the road. It can be a mess, such a mess. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then the other big one, so get clear on what you want, is the first piece. And then the second one is never complain. This is, Gigi, you taught me this, never complain and never explain. And so this is when you're communicating to someone about a boundary or about a request. it's not to go in and just start complaining about all the ways they've crossed your boundaries in the past. You're like, let's just take a partnership, for example, and you go to your husband or your wife and you go, oh, you always do this, or you never do this, or this is so frustrating. It's been going on for so long. It's probably not the way to start the conversation. I would say it's not. In fact, you don't want to go there really at all, ideally. Ideally, you just want to say, like, hey, I've been really thinking about this. And there's something I would love to make a request around. And, I'm wondering if you could take out the trash once a week or whatever, like whatever it is. That's not really a boundary. That's more of just a request. I'm trying to think of a boundary version of that. But what did we say earlier? Like or maybe they said that they would do something like that and they haven't been. That's probably more of a boundary. So, hey, it's not that you don't state that at all, but you could just say, hey, I was just curious. We had talked about you taking the trash out once a week, and I noticed that hasn't really been happening. What's going on there? Or is there something else we could do to really make sure that happens? So notice how there's not a lot of complaining in that. There's just kind of a stating of a fact. And it's not like pointing fingers and everything else. You're not complaining and you're not over explaining. You're just sort of stating, this is what we talked about and it hasn't really been happening. Like, what could we do there? So that could be an example of maybe how to approach a conversation like that. Is there more you want to say about that one, Gigi?
No, I do want to say, though, this is really difficult. Like, it's so hard to do. Yeah. When we're personally connected with people and we have a history and there's a pattern of communication, it's so easy just to go unconscious. And like you said, Makena, just go and share, you said you're going to do this. I can't believe you don't do it, and then you go off on a tangent of all the other things they haven't done. And then you ask for what you want. And then the person's like, there's no way I'll ever give you what you want.
Because they're on the defensive at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's so easy. And I get it, you guys. Believe me, I make a mistake all the time. But it's so right on with a little finesse and a little, but a little taking time. This again takes a bit more time than just go in and lay it all out there, what they've done wrong and what you want. So it takes more time. And so we get frustrated because we feel like, oh my gosh, why should I have to do this? And I always say, this communication is like an art. And so in it, learning that artful communication in the long run is going to save you so much time and energy. Yeah. But when you're beginning, it feels like frustrating and that it costs a lot of time and energy.
I mean, it's so much of what we work with our clients around, not boundaries specifically, although those come up, but just communication, in their personal and their professional lives. And this is really your genius, Gigi. And so much, again, of what you've taught me is how do you have those communications or those conversations in a way that's more neutral or in a way that's more, to me, it's like more collaborative versus combative or like you against the other person. It's like you going in be like, this is what we talked about, or this is the result I would want. And then inviting them into the conversation of like, how can we make this happen? Can they get on board with that? Or maybe they already said they were. How can we make this happen? Or what's going on there? And I think there's just something in that approach, which is very easy to say at a high level. And like you said, very nuanced when it comes down to how to actually do that in each situation. But that's been a huge thing that's made a difference. But just starting with the thing of not complaining and not over explaining. I think those are just really great rules kind of to keep in the back of your mind. Am I getting in here and just complaining a bunch? Because it's immediately going to put the other person on the defensive. So if you're nitpicking all the time, they're just going to be like, they're going to turn their ears off and stop even listening. Right. So easier said than done, but very powerful.
The explaining, because I work with clients on this all the time. They'll tell me they're going to go in and talk to someone. And then I say, do not go in and explain yourself. Just share what you want or share what you want to do. very clearly. The less words, the better,
Mm,
because people feel bad or they feel like they have to explain themselves. But the truth is, when you do that, you weaken the whole situation. You create a murky situation. Clear communication is usually, acknowledgement, request, like you said, stating this is what we said. How can we work this out together? Because I know, and again, I know we both want to have this work. What can we
yeah.
do here? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've talked about how to get clear on where you need to set better boundaries, and then a couple of tips on how to really communicate those boundaries in a healthy way. So the next question we want to cover, and the last question, is what if other people don't respect my boundaries after I've set them? And I'm laughing because Gigi and I were having a whole conversation about this before the recording. Um,
Mm.
yes. So this one is, again, where something like an agreement or a contract could come into place, even if it's just a verbal agreement. And this does take some time up front, but it's so important. If there's a recurring breakdown, to step back and to have this conversation or to put this agreement in place. And what that agreement needs to be is, what is it you're both agreeing to? And if that doesn't happen, what is the consequence? Right? So if the other person or you, whoever, is involved, or maybe it's both of you, doesn't do the thing they said they were going to do, then what is the consequence, or what would happen? And these don't have to be huge sweeping ultimatums. I think that's often people default to that a little bit and are like, well, then, bye-bye, we're no longer
Mhm.
friends, or
Mhm.
whatever that might be. Then you're fired.
Mhm.
They can be incremental consequences. So it can kind of be like, hey, the first time this happens, then this is what we're agreeing the consequence would be. If it happens again, then this would be the consequence. And maybe it is like a 3 strikes kind of thing. If, let's say, it's an employee or something like that, then, if you get written up for this 3 times, then we would, at that point you would be fired. So you could have something like that, but basically there can be sort of these incremental consequences that you both agreed to ahead of time, maybe even collaborated to come up with what those would be. And that way, again, it's just in writing. It's very clear. There doesn't need to be a lot of conversation or drama when it happens. You just say, hey, this happened. This is what we talked about as far as a consequence. And then you uphold that agreement. Does that feel like it covers it, Gigi?
Yes. And, I've had tons of times with clients in a work setting. And I think, like you said, McKenna, one of the ways I always tell them, if there is something that keeps on reoccurring, is really to go to the person and say, this isn't working. And what do you think the consequences should be? And
Yeah.
that's a great way to start, and to have the person think, because what it does is it allows them for a moment to kind of sit in your shoes. And sometimes I tell them to say, if it was you in my situation, how would you handle it? And so it gives people a different view than feeling defensive and kind of attacked. And so that's a beautiful way. And sometimes people say, I don't know. I've had many times people do this with their kids, and the consequences the kids come up with are a lot stricter than what the parent would have come up with. But it makes people start to think, and for your children, it starts to teach them how to think in this way.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And you may not do a contract with everything, right? So, excuse me, if you're talking about your partner taking out the trash, you may not have a contract around that.
Right.
Although you guys may sit down at some point and look at what are your different household responsibilities, or what are the different things, and just write something up so that's clear. And then talk about, hey, if this, we keep having breakdowns, what happens here? So you could follow a similar structure, but I think we kind of, going back to what we shared in the last one about a collaborative approach, I think that's what you're really talking about here, Gigi, even with the employees or the kids, is like, what can we do here? What do you see? So not just going in and saying, oh my gosh, you did this or you didn't do that, and again, complaining or or just being frustrated or resentful or starting a fight around it, but really being like, hey, what's going on here? Do you just keep forgetting? Like, is it that you're super busy? Do you really just hate taking out the trash? Like, go in and try to like understand where the other person's coming from. That's a huge piece. I'm using the example of like a marriage or something, because then it's not like just pointing fingers or just getting frustrated with them. They might say to you, like, I just forget. And if that's the case, then you go, okay, well, what do you see could work there? Or maybe you suggest something. Could we set an alarm that goes off on your phone every Sunday night? And so this is where that more collaborative approach versus, again, just like frustration, pointing fingers, blaming, ultimatums. So.
Yeah. And the other reason to do it is people are busy. And so you have this conversation and the intentions are good. But I have this a lot of times with couples is then, they're busy and they forget, right? And so this is where even simple things like the household, you make your list, you put it on the refrigerator, it says John and Sally, or whatever, and you have the two names and you know what you're supposed to do. It visually, every time you go on the refrigerator, you go, oh yeah, I remember now. Because, often it's not intentional. They're like, oh yeah, where was that list? I've had that happen so many times.
Totally. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's basically it. And some common mistakes that come up here just in general around boundary setting. We've touched on these already, but the first one is not keeping your word with yourself first. So, if you and your partner, let's say, come up with agreements, if you're not upholding your side, then they're going to see that and they're going to be like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I don't really need to uphold mine, right? So that's an example. But the other thing I mean around not keeping your word is like, if a boundary is crossed, not upholding the consequence or not going to the other person and broaching that conversation, people instead just tend to get frustrated or resentful, not bring it up, and it builds and it builds and it builds until it erupts. And so this is you really stepping up to go, I'm going to be someone who not only has these conversations in advance and comes up with these agreements or contracts or whatever they might be, but it's like if a client, for example, going back to my previous, career or even just going to coaching with our clients who we're teaching about this, who have their own coaching clients. It's like, okay, we have certain agreements up front in terms of if they cancel a session or whatever it might be, and you communicate that up front. Now you can always make an exception, but you have to feel good about that exception, right? It has to be like, hey, normally this is my policy that if, this happens, then, you forfeit your session or whatever. In this case, I'm happy to make an exception. So if you want to do that, you can, but you want to remind them of the boundary first. Like, hey, here was the boundary. I'm going to make an exception. But what we see sometimes is that people just keep doing that and keep doing that, right? And then they're frustrated. And there comes a point at which you just go, okay, because you canceled in less than 24 hours, then the session is not, we're just going to forfeit the session and we'll do your next one. So that's what I mean too, around upholding your own boundaries or following through on what you said you're going to do, is there comes a point at which you have to be willing to, I don't know how to say that, but you have to be willing to uphold what you guys talked about and not just sort of let people walk all over you. Otherwise you end up, again, frustrated over time. What are some other mistakes, Gigi, that people make?
Yeah, the other is, thinking that you have to make these like huge ultimatums, like we talked about earlier, or sweeping changes or eliminate people out of your life. And so those, instead of preparing and like we talked about and really making clear about what are the agreements and what are the boundaries that you're holding. And if people don't do it, then getting upset and frustrated. And I think the other thing is not having those consequences set up to where if it does break down, then you don't have to go to these huge sweeping changes because you've already talked that through.
Yeah.
And then the last one is, always creating drama instead of simply stating what you want. Having so much frustration that when you do deliver, you deliver in a way that, again, creates defensiveness or blames people, or you do a lot of explaining and you don't just ask for what you want. Hey, like you said, we agreed upon this. It's not happening. I'm just curious what's going on here. And, how can we make this happen in the future? What needs to happen here?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. So just to tie this all up, it's, pick one area to start. No, you don't have to take every single area of your life. I mean, you could systematically over time, but pick one area where you feel resentful or frustrated, or where you've been saying yes if you really mean no. And then first is to really ask yourself, is there anything I need to change in my own behavior here, right? Is there something I'm not fully in integrity with, or asking for, or upholding? And then you want to get clear on what it is you want, like we talked about it, and really communicate that. And if you need to put contracts or verbal agreements or consequences in place, that's all a part of that conversation. And a last point here is that you are training people how to treat you. And we do. And so when there's someone who feels a lot of frustration, or they are, feel like everybody crosses their boundaries and they're looking outside of themselves going, everybody else is always doing this, the first thing to do is, again, to look inward and go, have I been clear? Have I been asking for what I want? Have I been, once we say what the agreement is, upholding my side and making sure that things are talked about? And so again, it's just to go, you will train people over time by the way you uphold your word with yourself, but also with the agreements that you set. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, this is a meaty topic.
It is a meaty topic. So if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at support@wayofthemuse.com. And we love, if there's someone in your life that you think would get value from this episode, please, please, please share it with them. That's how we spread the word about this podcast. And this is a really powerful one. So it can make a huge shift for you and for other people in your life. So thank you, Gigi.
Thank you, McKenna. And if you really liked this this episode, please go in and like it, and also give us stars on the podcast. We'd love so other people see that you like the podcast, and we can share it with more and more people.
Yeah, ratings, reviews, shares, all of it's helpful. So
yeah,
thank you, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
That's our episode for today, but let's not make it the end of our love story. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and think of some women in your life you'd love to share it with. And if you want to learn more about our events and programs, visit wayofthemuse.com. See you next time.